You are listening to.
You are listening to.
And you are listening to.
You are listening to.
You are listening to.
You are listening to. And you are listening to.
Digital watches are a pretty neat idea.
Hey Brian, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jeff. How are you?
Well, I have a confession.
Uh-oh.
We've talked a couple of times about needing multiple reasons to do things.
Yes, we have.
And if you can come up with 3, it's an automatic.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
correct.
I'm trying to decide to do this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
One of my reasons was to force myself to read this book.
Okay. Interesting.
All
right.
So the whole reason that we're doing this is for this episode right here.
Well, that's great. That's fantastic.
And this episode is about Eoin Colfer's book, And Another Thing.
Mm-hmm.
This title was taken from the 4th book, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish.
Okay.
Where the other sequels were all taken from the 1st book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I immediately had a problem with it just looking at the title.
You're saying that you came in with an attitude already, Jeff?
I came in with an attitude already, yes.
My goodness.
And it's a long book.
Mm-hmm. It is a very long book. In fact, I've got a couple anecdotes, if you will, about reading the book that I'd like to bring up.
If you look at the runtime of the audio versions, this one is 10 hours and 22 minutes long.
Wow. And
we thought that Doctor Who and the Cricket Men was a long book. And it came in at 9 hours and 45 minutes.
And you know what's funny? It's even Doctor Who and the Cricket Men seems short in comparison.
Yes. But the first couple of books all fall into a pretty close pack.
Okay.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, runtime 4 hours, 59 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Restaurant, 5 hours, 47 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Life the Universe, 5 hours, 48 minutes. So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, the shortest one, 4 hours and 39 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly Harmless, 6 hours, 33 minutes.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, it's really, really kind of interesting. Let me tell you my little anecdotes about reading the book. First off, I did read the book. We've talked about the different patterns and different processes we've used before.
Right.
And as you said, I wanted to have the experience of having read the book. What is interesting to me about that is I always have a different feeling when I read a book compared to when I listen to a book.
Okay.
I really wanted to read this book, and I happened to be going on vacation, so it just technically worked out better for me that I would read it.
Well, when you listen to audio, the style of the reader can really skew the presentation.
Absolutely. 100%. And what was funny about this is I read it with an ebook.
Okay.
So I'm looking on my Nook, and I find a copy of the book, and I download it. So I start reading, and my wife looks over at me as I'm reading it. She starts laughing, and I'm like, "What are you laughing at?" And she said, "Well, the font on that is ridiculous." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, it's huge, and the font's, ridiculously large font." And I'm like, "Oh, I didn't really notice it too much." So I went ahead and I looked, and I actually counted the number of words on the average page.
Okay.
It was 120 words on the average page. Probably the font size would be equivalent to maybe a 10 or 12 or something. It was pretty large. I never was able to figure out, and I know Nook can manipulate the font size if you wanted to. But frankly, after my surgery last year with my eyes, it was just easier to read at that size.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it also came up in the book that it had page numbers, which indicated when I first started reading it was 266 pages. And at 120 words per page, that turns out to be close to 32,000 words.
Okay. Hi, it's Jeff here. I wanted to make a slight correction. When Brian was talking about the number of words per page and the number of pages per book, what he did not realize is that the font size that he was using for his Nook had 3 screens per page. So he counted a single screen to get his average words per page, when that was actually 1/3 of the actual count. So the book that he said was 32,000 words is actually 96,000 words.
What was interesting about that particular thing and the Nook, as I was reading through it, for some reason, and this is the only time I've ever seen this, my Nook showed me the page number, and it told me how long I had left in the chapter. It literally would say 1 hour and 45 minutes left in this chapter. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
I never was able to figure out how it estimated or knew how many hours it would take me to finish reading a chapter.
There has to be an algorithm based on how often you turn a page.
Must be. It must have been something like that. It was just very, very odd that every page I turned, it would tell me how many hours I had left in the chapter. And I found that very interesting. And I know we're going to talk about this because that's the reason we're here. Different experience from reading the book to listening to the book.
Okay.
It was tremendously different, in my opinion.
The only time I read the book is while I was listening to it, and I missed the beep, turn the page. So I didn't just sit down and read it. I was reading along with the audio so I could make some detailed notes and get the quotes correct.
Interesting audio with Simon Jones, you said, right?
Yes.
Simon Jones being one of the people who was in the original show, is that right?
Correct. He was on the TV show and the original radio program.
Oh, okay. And he played
Arthur.
Arthur. Okay, very good, very good. So it was interesting that we could listen to it in his voice. Although I have to be honest.
And he was also the floating head in the movie that was warning them when they arrived at Magra Theater.
That is correct. That is correct. But I have to admit to the fact that after a short period of time of listening to the book, I sped it up.
Right. Well, I sped it up too because I couldn't believe how much faster you read than you can vocally read. So I sped it up because I tried to go to 2, but I couldn't understand them.
It's funny because I've listened to it faster on my phone, and I have an iPhone, and at 2 I also could not really understand it. But what was weird was I listened to it later using my Nook or my tablet.
Okay.
And with the tablet at 2, I didn't have any trouble.
Oh.
So I'm not sure if the speed was exactly 2.
Right.
Maybe it was 1.75 or something, but because it was definitely understandable on my tablet, whereas on my phone it was, gibberish.
About that, though, I'm enjoying that the technology has advanced where you can speed things up without changing the tone.
Right.
So it sounded like Simon Jones reading faster.
Right.
It didn't become chipmunk-like with the high-pitched voice like it used to be probably back when the original Hitchhiker was written. That's the only way you could do it.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I sort of feel like even though this is a unique situation for us being in the same room and doing the recording, I feel like you and I are both ignoring the whale in the room.
The book? Yeah. Yeah, we are. Well, okay, so we'll talk about the book a little bit. The book starts out with a foreword that has some amusing aspects. It talks about typing the phrase Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy into the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And it says that you will get 3 results, even though you can see 5 listed below. So I thought that was kind of neat because if you're looking at the opening pages of the book, it's going to say it was based on these books. So I thought that was kind of funny. So I thought, well, hey, starting out pretty good.
I did think it was interesting, but this is actually prior to that moment in the book.
Okay.
Where they have a quote from Douglas Adams. Did you mention that?
I did not mention the quote.
Okay, well, so in the book version of the book, I don't know if they mentioned this in the audio version or not, but in the book version of the book, it says that there's a quote from Douglas Adams. "The storm has now definitely abated, and what thunder there was now grumbled over more distant hills, like a man saying, "And another thing," 20 minutes after admitting he had lost the argument.
Yes. That is the quote from So Long and Thanks for All the Fish.
That's correct.
That he named the book after.
Right.
Or titled the book after.
And then there was one more acknowledgement, and I think these were by Eoin Colfer, who actually wrote the book.
Correct.
He added these. Another one from Tenacious D, which is, "We traveled through space and time, my friends, to rock this house again."
Okay.
So he was eager to tell the story.
Yes, he was. So another nod to the original Hitchhikers he did right after he talked about typing the Hitchhiker's Guide into the Hitchhiker's Guide.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a nod to the, if your idea of numerical order is from small to large type of thing. So
Yes.
It's already doing a messing with numbers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it says that the 5 articles in the Hitchhiker's Guide are long and full of audio and video. And what I liked that is the tie-in to the original book. It says, this is not the story of those articles.
Yeah, exactly. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
It says, but if you scroll down past Article 5, ignoring the offers to remortgage your kidneys and lengthen your porn wrangler. So now that he uses this word porn wrangler over and over and over, and I didn't find the word funny anywhere after the first usage of it. So
Yes, I agree. He does tend to overuse that particular phrase. And obviously it's a nod to a special appendage or something, but...
yes. Yes.
But he does tend to use it over and over and over and over again.
So after that bit, it says that it will say in the guide, if you like this, then you might also like to read. If you have your icon rub itself along this link, you will be led to a text-only appendix with absolutely no audio and not so much as a frame of video. This is the story of that appendix. So even though the cover says this is part 6 of 3,
Mm-hmm.
making it sound like it is equal to the other books,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
here it's reducing itself to an appendix.
Exactly. This is as he defines it, Appendix 5. It's a side note of a side note about a history of a story.
Okay, so with that being said, after experiencing this whole novel,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? How is this an appendix?
Mm-hmm.
An appendix to me is additional reading to help you better understand the original story, I guess.
Right.
And this only confused the issues in many, many, many ways. And I have great difficulty figuring out the timeline and how it fits.
Yes. I mean, I know we're going to get into a lot of detail about that, and it's interesting. And this is the beginning of where I felt there was a difference between the original read-through and the audio listen. And I'm not sure how deep to get into this particular discussion at this time, but I will say that reading the book was an enjoyable experience overall.
Okay.
I did find that his use of parenthetical comments, in addition to the guide inserts that we'll go through, I'm sure many of them, because there are many.
Well, the guide notes and parenthetical additions, I don't know if I noticed any parenthetical additions that were outside guide notes, but
yeah, he did do it though. I mean, if you're when you're reading the book, he'll say something like but that's not what the silastic armor themes of the blah 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 blah. That's what I'm referring to in this particular case. They aren't strictly parenthetical, but they draw us away from the story. And they aren't listed as the guide says or the guide note. I mean, so there's a lot of that in this book. And when I was reading through it And that's one of the reasons why I actually started looking at the number of words on the page.
Right.
He gets to one of those type of side parts.
Okay. Yes.
Almost every other page in this book.
With the PDF versions, you can type in a phrase,
Mm-hmm.
and it will give you how many times does this phrase appear in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So before every guide note, he types or writes guide note.
That's correct.
So if I type guide note into the search bar of the PDF,
Mm-hmm.
there are 64 guide notes in this book. Just over 5 per chapter.
Mm-hmm. 5 per chapter. And I mean, that becomes tedious, I have to say.
It really broke up the story for me. Took me right out of it.
It does. And this is part of the reason why I think I find the cloud of this story to be hard to follow, because it is embedded within itself, just like he describes the appendix being the 5th appendix of 3, So I feel like there's a significant part to that part of the storytelling.
Yes. Douglas used guide notes. He didn't call them guide notes, but they would be guide notes because they would be in italics or something in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Or the whole story would change and stop, and you could tell when there was a guide note. But it would be some social commentary that was pertinent to the day, and it was interesting, and it was funny, where none of these were. It's not that they were not funny at all,
Right.
but I had difficulty relating them to anything that was happening other than, hey, I think this is kind of funny.
Okay. Right. And I agree. But I do have to applaud Eoin on the fact that he was clearly researched and understood the universe that Douglas Adams created.
Right.
Because there are occasions when he creates his own or
Mhm.
adds significantly to Douglas's concept of his universe. But he frequently refers to something created by Douglas Adams and embellishes, if you will,
Right.
some of the creatures and the people that live within the universe that Douglas has already defined. And he doesn't ignore it. He doesn't roll over it with a steamroller, but he does at least acknowledge and bring in Douglas's story to his story.
I agree. I will say that there are many, many instances where he interweaves Douglas's story and his story together seamlessly where you don't notice it.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you do notice it,
You notice it.
it's because it feels like I'm going to throw this term in here to remind you this is a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy story. Because I have gone so far into the weeds with my own concept and ideas that I need to find a way to bring you back to say, oh, remember. Because sometimes it was like, why did he mention this here?
Right.
Or like we laugh about what Douglas does with the Left No Joke Untold, where he's going to find a way to fit something in from the radio series that's been left out of the books.
Yes.
That he had a list of what am I going to mention. And as he gets toward the end of the book, he's like, oh, I haven't used this yet. And I'm going to toss that in there.
Yeah, that's kind of funny because after reading and listening to the book, I was doing a little bit more research trying to find out some information about the book. I happened to read that Douglas Adams made a comment after having finished the whole series that he kind of wished he had left the series in a more positive way.
Yes.
That the last story was a little too dark, and he thought maybe it would be nice to have something more positive as a final spin. But it also mentions just exactly what we would expect from Douglas Adams. He had finished writing Dirk Gently.
Right.
And had some leftover material that he thought would be good for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, and I just love that.
Right. Oh. All right. So, also in the introduction, there's a very brief summary of the first 5 books. And in that, he does a joke where he mentions U-Bid, which is an eBay competitor that has since gone out of business.
Mm-hmm.
UBID is mentioned 7 more times throughout the book.
Yes.
And I do not know why he keeps referring to UBID and why he thinks that UBID is so funny or interesting or pertinent to how you buy things.
I don't know, but UBID and the fact that it doesn't exist and does exist in the story, I think it's him playing with time and having a laugh on his own. Like, I kind of get that impression because as we know at the end of the story, UBID shows up at the end as its final delivery,
Right.
I do want to mention one thing about his recap, which kind of made me a little upset.
Okay.
In his recap of the story, he creates his own reason for why the Earth needed to be destroyed. He says that it was nepotism and that they were trying to get a couple of their cousins something to do.
Right.
And I was like, we don't need another reason for the Earth to have been destroyed.
Yes.
Douglas already gave us plenty of reasons. So
yes, he
his
did.
having added that when you talk about things he didn't need to do, that's probably one of the things that I immediately picked up on. He didn't need to give us another reason for having destroyed the Earth. The Vogons did it for the various reasons that Douglas Adams has already told us.
Correct. I think every book has a different reason.
They do. And that's why even Douglas says that each book is its own universe. So
right.
Given that statement, I'm going to give Eoin a little bit of leeway.
So if you haven't guessed yet, we have just finished the introduction in the foreword, and we're approaching a half an hour.
Oh my gosh.
So
We're
this
never
is
gonna get
definitely going to be a 2-part episode.
Mhm.
We're going to do the first half of the book now, do the second half of the book as our bonus episode, same way we did Doctor Who and the Cricket Men.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But before we get into Chapter 1, Brian, what are your general overall impressions of the book?
Okay. So we've kind of touched on it a little bit already, but I will say that having read the book when I was reading it, I was intrigued because it was new material.
Right.
I liked the way that Owens respected Douglas Adams's universe. He took and added creatures and events to parts of Douglas Adams's world that already existed.
Yes.
And he didn't abuse them, as I said. I mean, the Sand Tragedy and Fish were just as happy as they would have been.
Right. Yes.
Essentially, that's what I was looking at. But as I said before, the thing that annoyed me was too many side trips, too many bits of information that I didn't need to know about in order for the story to go forward.
Right.
The other thing that I thought in this particular story is it's like Adams' stories in that very little plot.
Okay.
In my opinion, very little plot.
I will say very little Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy plot.
Yes. Okay. And a lot of extraneous commentary. And
Okay, yeah.
and the other thing is that after having read it, it was a drudgery to listen to it. And that may have just been me. But when I listened to it, I didn't have any idea how long it was going to take me to listen, even at 1.5 speed. It was a ridiculously long time.
But you listened to it after you had read it the first time.
Correct.
Okay. So could be something like this. When you were reading it the first time, there's always this, maybe you'll get better. But when you're listening to it the second time, you already know what the ending is and where
true.
it's going.
That's true.
And the maybe it's get better is it's a joke. That I mean, the more accurate would be, where is this going?
Right.
Is this going to go to a happy, satisfying end,
Mm-hmm.
or is it going to go horribly wrong?
Mm-hmm.
You've answered that already when you're going through it the
Right,
second time.
right, right. And what's the old joke? There's only 2 fatal flaws in this book. One is that it exists,
Yeah.
and the other is the way it was written.
Right.
I don't want to be that negative.
No.
I really don't feel that way about this book.
So it is much, much easier to talk about the things you don't like because you noticed those.
Right.
Everything you liked, unless it was outstanding. It didn't call attention to itself, but it was very good. So there is a lot of good in this book. This wasn't like the worst book I ever read.
Oh, no, by no means.
So I don't want you to get that impression out there that this is just a piece of trash that you should never ever pick up and read. It deserves a chance to be read, but we'd like you to know what you're getting into so you can be in the frame of mind that's going to say, oh, good, I'm glad they prepared me for this.
Right. And on top of that, I mean, the Cricket Men book, I mean, I know that was supposed to be a Doctor Who adventure.
Right.
But that was far more torturous and far less sensitive to Douglas Adams than this book is. I want to reemphasize the fact that Eoin has made an effort to delve into Douglas Adams' universe. And although he does take himself out of it occasionally, he does come back and respects it in this book. And I like that very much about this book.
So my overall impression, I have a couple of things that bothered me. And I can point out specific examples as we're going through it. But I want to get out in general because he does it over and over. The first one is when I'm reading the other 5 books, the story is around Arthur. To me, this is Arthur's story, or it's a story from Arthur's perspective. There are times that they do go to where Arthur isn't, but that's so you can understand the motivations of these people when they get back to Arthur. But far and wide, it's Arthur's story, where this book, Arthur's in it, but he's not even the main character.
He's just a foil.
That kind of bugged me. The other thing is Douglas Adams liked to name things funny things. I read that it started in the radio scripts, and he liked to do it to annoy the woman who had to type out the scripts.
Right. I remember you saying that.
The name Slarty Bartfast, he wanted the most offensive sounding name that was actually not offensive. So he sat down and he wrote down all kinds of other things. So he did that with all of his characters and the character names. They aren't so on the nose of rewording existing things. He would do that with drinks, and that was one of his jokes. The gin and tonics was spelled all kinds of different ways, pronounced gin and tonic. So that was one thing, but his name's like Vroomfondle, and you got Magic Thighs in
Magic
there.
Thighs, yeah.
You've got Loonquill and Fook, which is a Phou. I mean, it's like it comes really close to being an offensive word, but when you're looking at it on the paper, absolutely not. Some of his names were a little bit odd and just too much on the nose of a regular saying. So I didn't like that as much as I enjoyed Douglas Adams naming things. All right, we've made it to chapter 1.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
So he decided to start this book off, to me, in the most confusing way possible. And at the same time, it is starting off from exactly where Mostly Harmless ended. However, there's no way to know that when you're reading it.
That's correct. That is correct. I think it's important at this point that I let you at least advance the plot before we talk about some of the details, because if we don't know what's happening here, it's going to get real confusing when we go forward.
I want our audience to be in exactly the same place that we were in. No.
A cloud of confusion?
Right, yes. So what happens is the Guide Mark II, because of an impulse from random, wanted all of our main characters to live full and happy lives exactly how they would have wanted. So in the blink of an eye, I like to compare it to the Star Trek Next Generation Picard and the Flute episode, where he lived an entire life on this strange planet, which was only a blink of an eye on the Enterprise. So he slowed down time, blink of an eye. They all lived out these existences, and then boom, they're right back at Stavromula's Club Beta.
Right. I do want to add, it's not like an impulse from Random. It's more of a directive from Random. Random is one of the co-owners, if you will, of the
Yes.
Mark II. And at the Mark II says, I did this because Random told me to. Essentially, that's what he says. So
In my multiple readings of it, I've interpreted that a couple of different ways.
mhm.
Yes, Random told him to, but it wasn't in a discussion. It was Random just going, oh my God, I've not lived my life, or something like that.
Right, but I only reason I'm harping on this a tiny bit is because the book literally says that Random told me to make sure I kept that pointy-chinned friend of hers alive.
That's
So-
true. They did have a conversation because
Yes.
they did have that whole thing
Right.
about the no chin.
Right, and
The chinless, that's
right,
it, chinless.
guy. Yeah, exactly. and the reason that's important to me in this discussion between the two of us is that it really points out a fatal flaw in this book.
Okay,
All right, and we'll get to that later.
right.
Okay.
Now that we know that the Guide Mark II has created a construct for our four main characters to live out their lives, and the book starts out with each of their lives being told.
Mhm.
And so you're reading this not having any idea what any of this has to anything, and to add to the confusion, and I don't even know if it's good or bad, if it's intentional to be good, if it's intentional to be confusing. Arthur starts out on a beach,
Yes.
which I'm like, that's kind of good, but he never said beach house, did he?
There was a shack.
It was, yeah.
Or there was a shack
Was
involved.
there a shack involved? I
Yes.
don't ever remember any kind of structure.
Not in the first part, but later on there's a shack. Because, well, I mean, now we're skipping all the way to the end of the book.
But so anyway, when you're reading about Arthur living his life on this beach,
Mhm.
it makes perfect sense,
Mhm.
but you don't know how or why of it.
Right, right.
Like, where is this going? When is this coming from? Trisha and Random became president of the galaxy, and Trisha was mostly robot at this point because her journalistic career has made her lose all kinds of limbs in her covering wars and stuff. And they ended up where Trisha was going to do an interview with Random, who was going to marry her little furry pet. It just gets really weird.
Flayboys or Flaybos.
Yes.
I mean, I
and then I can't remember right now off the top of my head where Ford
was at the spa every day for this
The spa.
entire existence. He was
Yes.
at this fabulously wealthy, hugely expensive spa, getting his brain cleansed and his chin sharpened.
Yes, he had a chin.
Oh my gosh.
And then later on in the book, they would talk about him going to rub his chin, and it wasn't there.
Yeah, yep. Oh my goodness. And this is where it's kind of irritating, but it's only after listening and reading the entire book and listening to it now a second time that the flaw I was talking about comes in here. And as we get a little further on here, these four coexisting lives for Trillian, Random, and Arthur are happening within a microsecond of time
Right.
in the real world, but they're 30 or 40 years of life that they've
Or
lived.
100.
100 years of life, is it? Okay.
I mean, yeah, it was like a century.
Okay. 100 years of life that they're living during that entire period of time. And each of those lives individually were directed by the individual.
Yes.
So Ford's life at this luxury spa, that's exactly the life he wanted to live.
Correct.
And Arthur's life, Arthur sort of let life come to him. So ending up on a beach like that seems perfectly logical. Now, we know that the Mark II was co-owned by Random. So Random should know that she's living in a construct.
Yes, she should.
She should know that, okay? Now, there's a lot of effort made in the rest of the book to suggest she had no idea.
Correct.
But that's just plain wrong, okay? And the other thing that really drives me nuts is the Mark II, this multi-dimensional, non-filtered, amazing piece of technology, runs out of battery power.
Yes.
That's how this part of the story ends, folks. The bird comes on and says, battery.
Yes, the battery dies, and that takes them out of their construct.
And that just is so wrong. There's no way this thing could exist on all these levels and not know how to create its own energy or get new energy.
It exists everywhere. It could take from the sun.
I'm sorry, folks, but that's a fatal flaw in my estimation.
Yeah, absolutely.
It did, as Jeff has mentioned a number of times, when you have an event that takes you out of the book, right, that is a flaw within the story.
And it started at the beginning of chapter 1.
I know.
So immediately you're taken out of the book. And I mentioned it was confusing, and I probably didn't explain why it was or how it was confusing for me, because a lot of books you don't know where they're going.
Right.
But when you start reading this book, the last book you know is mostly harmless.
Mm-hmm.
If you did not listen to the radio show, where at the end they just decided to say, oh, by the way, just kidding, everybody's still alive.
Yeah, that's another little nod that I kind of liked in the story. But
yeah, we can get to that in a little bit, because I can go through a little bit more of this detail.
Right.
It starts off describing a man on the beach.
Right.
First thing I thought again was beach house, but I'm like, wait, no, they're all dead. If you don't,
right,
they're all dead.
Yeah, I didn't think it was Arthur. I thought it was the guy,
Wonko the Saint.
Yes, I did. Or I thought it was the.
It said it starts off describing a man on the beach who I thought was Wonko the Saint. Then it says who has difficulty believing in anything and thinks he might once have had a cat.
Right.
I'm like, oh, it's the man who rules the universe.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly who I thought it was, and I think that was intentionally written that way.
I'm sure it was, but if you want to say everything's in their own universes, Arthur only had a cat in the radio shows.
Okay.
He had a dog.
That's right.
In the books.
Right.
But there was no cat mentioned in the books. The cat came in as a radio series when he got back. I think it was the book 4. Mm-hmm. He got back to his house and there was a dead tabby in his house.
Right. And I was reading that this book was read as a BBC nighttime book story.
Oh, okay.
So it does have a couple of nods to the radio show, and in fact, as you just mentioned, they mentioned the book mentions the radio show ending, where everybody's describing, no, this is how we lived. No, this is how we lived. Random thought it was a bunch of unicorns, right?
Right.
And Tricia said, no, we went to the restaurant at the end of the universe.
Because the Babelfish all rescued us.
Yeah. So I mean, they're definitely a nod, if not a direct ripoff, if you will, of the radio show. So that I did think was kind of a fun thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Have we advanced the story at all here?
Well, all of chapter 1.
Yes.
So we're 1/12. All of chapter 1.
Don't scare our audience like that.
Was the constructs. Uh-huh. And then they get to chapter 2.
Right.
In chapter 2, the battery eventually dies.
Right.
And all of the constructs are merged together where they get to find out what's happening, and then they're back in Stavro, right where you left off with all of this devastation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As the battery is nearing depletion, the Mark II says there are 5 minutes left before they are back at Stavros, and a digital readout is projected with the countdown.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to how Ford was counting down
right.
before at the destruction. Then Ford muttered something about humans thinking digital watches are a pretty neat idea. And I'm like, that one to me was like wedged in, forced in there, because it wasn't a digital watch. It was a big readout.
Right.
So he's taken the idea. If he would have said clock, that'd have been one thing, but he wanted to use watch. So that was another time I got bounced right out.
Well, talk about wedging it in.
Okay.
There's the foreshadowing of the past that Eoin wedges in here, where he says that in Arthur's high school yearbook, he says he is listed as most likely to end up living in a hole in the Scottish Highlands with only a chip on his shoulder.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. I mean, it just slapped you in the face.
Right. Absolutely. Another thing I found strange is in the constructs that everybody lived for themselves, they all forgot their past. It wasn't a continuation from where they were. It was almost like everything before that didn't exist.
Right. And the thing that also I thought was really strange is, why did Trillian, I mean, I know she just lived her life according to what we understand, and the Mark II book was entertained by seeing how linear life progresses. But why did she imagine in her life she would become blown apart and turned into a robot?
I don't know.
Where did that come from?
Again, if you want to call that a flaw, to me that would have been random portraying it on her for abandoning her.
Yeah, I guess that could be that gives me at least a little bit of a motivation that I could understand. I mean, Random's life is idyllic in her own way. She becomes all powerful, basically. She becomes the president of the universe. So
yes,
that's a directed life. Whereas Trillian becomes a half human, half robot.
Right.
So maybe you're right. Maybe that's a projection from Random. Because even the Mark II says, in order to save power occasionally, I combined the two lives together into one. So that's why he was mushing Random and Trillian together occasionally.
Yes. It said that Random went from being president to being a goth teenager.
Yes.
And then there was actually a funny part guide note. Like, the first guide note I came to was funny and entertaining, and it was social commentary, and
1 out of 64. What a good odds.
There might be, I don't know, I can include some more. So I want to tell you what this guide note was.
Excellent.
So it was talking that goths are not confined to Earth. They're all over. So he described what some other species do. And it says, while the adolescents of Earth advertise their feelings of isolation by wearing black clothing and listening to rock bands with names like Bloodshock and Sputum, the Hulavu, a superintelligent shade of blue, demonstrate their dissatisfaction with the universe by holding their breath until they turn a deep purple. While the tubular Zingatularians, their deep-sea crustaceans, drive their parents demented by literally talking out of their asses. So, like, all right, that was kind of funny.
Oh, there was a couple little funny bits. I mean, I did appreciate, at least to some extent, the whole pom-pom squids. I'm not sure what he was thinking here, but these pom-pom squids apparently worked as masseuses at this ultra fancy spa where Ford was.
Right.
And they would put their little suckers on you and massage you, etc. But they did that because they heard that talent scouts occasionally came there, and they could make their musical careers advance by massaging these talent scouts. I mean, it's kind of a funny little aside note.
And the best part was that there was never, ever a talent scout that went to the spa.
That's right.
So it was just a ploy to get these squids to be masseuses.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I liked, though, was after the construct ended and they were back at Stavros and all of this chaos is ensuing, because they all had babelfish in their ears, they could understand the rats
Yes.
as they were scurrying to get away.
Oh my gosh.
And it said, so we get to hear a sample of what rats fleeing from a disaster would say. It was nothing interesting. It was just normal, hey, get out of my way type of stuff.
And again, here at the end, as the construct comes crashing down, there's another little nod that Owen gives to Douglas Adams, and that's where Arthur is reminiscing, oh no, that guy's going to show up again, and he's referring to Ford, he knows that Ford's going to show up again, and he says he's going to have that awful book. What's that book called? The Pitchforker's Pride is a Fallacy.
Yes.
Something like that.
He forgot.
I know, well, and then, but ultimately, what I do appreciate is he said, basically, nothing happened.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Oh, man.
As we mentioned, the constructs ended. They're back at Stavros. We've hit chapter 3. The first thing they do is they kill off the Tricia McMillan that's from that planet, leaving only Trillian. And she was never put in the construct. So when Random built it, she didn't go. And since death seemed to be certain, Ford pulled out a cigarette that was actually a dead, dry and stiff Phalian albino marshworm.
Mm-hmm.
1 puff makes you happy. 2 makes you curious. 3 explodes your brains.
Very odd.
So he just wanted to be happy and then just enjoy whatever was coming to him. And I think we joked about this in our discussion of Mostly Harmless and where it could go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we said was, since Zaphod is still there and still has the heart of gold, he could just show up and rescue him.
Right.
Well,
right.
Zaphod just showed up and rescued him.
Oh, gosh. Yes, he did. And therein lies the tale. We're like, obviously we're going to get into this as the other book, but Zaphod's life becomes too much of a mystery for me to figure out as this book goes on from here.
Like in secondary phase, when the Heart of Gold showed up and rescued Ford and Arthur when they were stuck in the crack in the ground beneath the giant boulder, which they couldn't move and no hope of rescue, the Heart of Gold shows up as Stavro. They
correct.
Basically said, here we are stuck in this no hope of rescue. It was, to me, that was a very close nod to that situation.
100%.
So Zaphod shows up. He's rescuing the group. They all run up onto the ship, and they're all saying things like, hey, Zaphod, glad you showed up. Glad you saved us. Just like everything but normal. But there's one huge problem of why I don't think they should have recognized him. Why would that be, Brian?
Zaphod, at this point, only has one head.
Yes. And the only way that works is if you imagine Zaphod as he was in the movie.
Right.
Where he had the flip heads. Because you wouldn't know he didn't have the second head.
Mm-hmm.
But the movie is the only place I have ever seen Zaphod having a head like that.
Right. That's right.
And later in this book,
Mm-hmm.
they will make it fact that it wasn't that way.
Right.
Because he talks about having 2 open collars in his shirt and still feeling an itch where his head was moved. So
right, and if you remember all the way back to the original book, they talk about Zaphod having a cage on his shoulder with a talking parrot inside.
That was in So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, when they were re-talking about that.
Right,
parrot.
so,
Yes.
so it's always been, at least from Douglas Adams' approach, to having 2 heads next to each other. And even, in fact, they always refer to his second head in this book as his left head.
His left head, yes.
You know, so
Yes.
a left head, and they sort of even reference...
Or left brain.
Left brain, right. That's his left head is his left brain, meaning that that's where all the intelligence was, and, you know, that kind of thing. So they kind of play off that whole left hemisphere part of the brain as being part of his head.
So this part, I think, is revealed later because they have many different discussions. But the way it is depicted is left brain has been removed and is hooked up to the computer of the Heart of Gold.
Correct.
So he's doing all the navigations and all of that kind of stuff.
Right.
Which
He's
fun.
but he's in the end he's floating around in a fishbowl.
Yes. Somewhere in the book, and I don't know where it was, and I don't even know if I've made a note about it there because it's just so ridiculous. He talks about planting seeds and ideas to have that happen, to have the other head decide.
Right.
He's the smart one. He decided that he did not want to be autonomous and be able to walk around the world and go wherever he wanted. He was able to talk the other one into cutting it off and sticking him in a jar and sticking wires in him. And he's a smart one. So that.
Well, yeah, I guess the only defense in that place is that it sort of infers or implies that while the left head was still attached to the body, his intelligence was diminished greatly by the right head.
Yes.
So it might have had to have been a subconscious approach until he became independent and the intelligence that the left head had appeared magically. Yes. Or reappeared or whatever, so that's how I kind of justified that whole thing. But you've already pointed out that easily recognizing him with one head doesn't make sense.
No, somebody shaves off their beard, you don't recognize them. Somebody gets a haircut who had long hair to short hair, you don't recognize them.
If you lose a head, someone's gonna
they're not going to know it's you. They can't possibly. They should have said, "Where's Zaphod?" And then he could have gone, "It is me." But instead, there's like 20 minutes of stuff going on before
Zaphod says,
"Notice anything?" What's different about you? Now, and I didn't think of it until this point.
Okay.
But the 100 years that everybody lived in the construct did seem to make them forget about everything in their past lives.
Right. That was a function of the construct or a function of the Mark II or something.
So for whatever reason, they may have only associated Zaphod with the Heart of Gold and not really understood. But that's too much of a ridiculous. I'm stretching for the guy. I'm stretching for the guy. I did like when Arthur asked about tea.
Yes.
The computer flagged the word tea, and it is no longer able to be used.
And it's funny that they make a point also that the ship is now functioning much better than it ever did with the old computer.
Yes, right.
And we're like, really?
And so this time, though, it is Ford who, in talking with Left Brain, sends him into a loop, crippling the ship while they're trying to escape the Grebulon death beams.
So Ford was arguing with Left Brain about the nature of improbability.
Okay.
That at this point, having saved them once and twice,
right,
that the probability of the Heart of Gold being involved with their saving this time was no longer an improbability. It was a fact.
Right, so he expected Zaphod to show up.
Correct. So he was arguing with him about this having nothing to do with improbability anymore, that this was a constant thing that was going to happen from here going forward.
Correct.
And they actually even play that up at the end of the story as well. So that loop caused the Left Brain to get stuck in improbability logic that didn't work for him, so he freaked out.
So anyway, the Heart of Gold is now stuck and can't leave the club. But Wildbagger arrives to insult Zaphod.
Well, that's the funny thing. Yes, you're right. He does arrive to insult Zaphod, and I guess the motivation that we understand is that Wildbagger recognizes that Zaphod is there, and he says, "Oh, well, now I have an opportunity to insult someone I've really wanted to insult, so I'm going to take advantage of it."
Before he's dead.
Yes, before he's dead. So it's like, Wait a minute. So Wowbagger's no longer doing the alphabetical thing, and
he talks about giving up later on,
and it's kind of all mishy-mashy.
Yeah. So anyway, he calls Zaphod a fat-ass bumpkin, and that really bothered Zaphod because you can't call him fat-ass. For whatever reason, fat-ass is the most offensive thing that you can say to Zaphod.
Actually calls him an arse.
Yes.
Throughout the book, it's always written as arse.
Arse. If there was an American edition.
I know.
It would say ass.
Oh my gosh. Hey, you know what? The other thing we didn't mention about Eoin, the author, is that he's responsible for having written the Artemis Fowl books.
Okay, yes.
And those are TA novels.
Correct.
So they're pretty famous.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, I saw the movie, and it was pretty good, but it was a little formulaic.
So when Wildbagger was talking about going out of order to make sure he insulted Zaphod, one of the things that he said was, you make exceptions for his caliber of an idiot. So Wildbagger's ship made it through the death beam because his ship is made up of dark matter and travels through dark space.
Mm-hmm.
So it can't be touched by real space. He's in dark space. The others wanted to be saved by him, but he said he can't take them, and Zaphod threatens to kill him. And Wildbagger's kind of thinking, oh, wait, I've kind of getting tired of this existence, and many people have tried to kill me, and I really want to die. So if you can kill me, I'll take you. And Zaphod thinks he can kill him.
Right. In fact, that is supposedly Wildbagger's deepest motivation. That his entire career of insulting people was because he thought he would insult the right person, and eventually that person would kill him.
Right.
So that was his deepest motivation, is hunting for someone who would be able to kill him.
Right. So in his discussion of wanting to be killed, there was something that was said that totally took me out of the book and made me shake my head and yell.
Mm-hmm.
Zaphod asked him if he's ever gone a few rounds with the ravenous bug bladder beast.
Mm-hmm.
And Wildbagger snorted, that old bag of bolts, like there's one of them. It is always called the bug bladder beast of Traal, but there aren't only one.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole planet of them.
Yes.
And if you want documentation, in The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, there's a passage about the guide writing articles that sound good, even if untrue. For instance, when the editors of the guide were sued by the families of those who had died as a result of taking the entry on the planet Traal literally, it said, ravenous bug bladder beasts often make a good meal for visiting tourists, instead of ravenous bug bladder beasts often make a good meal of the visiting tourists. So it is in the books, plural.
Yes, that's
but
correct.
that old bag of bolts means there's only one, and he's old and about to die and be none. And I'm thinking of that other passage, and it's taken me out of the book.
Right.
A little later in the same exchange, Zaphod told Wildbagger that he knew Thor and could have Thor kill him. Zaphod and Thor did not interact in any of the previous books, but in So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, at the party when Thor was hitting on Trillian, he said, "Didn't I see you at Milliways?" Trillian asked if he was the one with the hammer, and at Milliways the minor deities from the halls of Asgard were introduced, and one was mentioned as having a hammer. So we are right that I could understand all that. We had that discussion. Was it Thor? Wasn't it Thor?
Right.
Type of thing. They did the whole thing about Ford going to Hot Black's table, but if Zaphod had this social media relationship with Thor, you think there would have been some sort of a mention of that. But there was no mention or aside, or even if Zaphod would have just said in the book, hey, I know him.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's the type of thing that you take and you go, oh, I can make up any story I want and it has to be believed because Zaphod said, hey, I know that guy. But when there isn't that leap,
right,
it's now fabricated, and isn't necessarily true to the universe that Douglas Adams created.
Right. And this particular area here is going to cause us to have some angst. And we're going to discuss that probably infinitum here.
Right.
But one thing I do want to say at this moment is that the fact that this book has been written so much longer after the original books were written.
Right.
Eoin is taking what is currently in vogue, what is currently in fashion, and adding all of that to the universe that Douglas Adams has already created.
Right.
During Douglas Adams' original universe, we've had discussions about streaming movies and that kind of thing. So things were changing, but the introduction of the social media as a platform and the importance of social media on what they're referring to as sub-ether is strongly emphasized here. And that's one of the reasons why we kind of feel that there's this time warp that's about to happen.
Right.
That doesn't really work. And I don't know where we're going to fit all this in. But the relationship with Thor is a Thor point for me.
Oh my. That was truly a pun. No wordplay involved. All right, so we made it to chapter 4. The group has been saved. The Earth has been destroyed.
Uh-huh.
So we jump to Vogon Jeltz on his ship that is called the Business End.
Yes.
It never had a name in any of the books.
No. I kind of like the name.
I do. I am not saying that it's a bad name.
Yep.
But I don't know why he felt he needed to name it. But again, it's a good name. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. He has a subordinate to which we find out later is his son.
Right. And I got to tell you, this one really bugged me. Okay?
So Vogon Jeltz is a prostetnik.
Yes.
All of his subordinates, or some of his subordinates, are constants. Mm-hmm. So constant is a title.
Yes.
Not a name.
Right, and we learned about prostetnik as a title.
Correct.
Many moons ago at this point.
So constant is the same. Mm-hmm. And so what you were saying was going to bug you?
So I'm reading the book.
Correct.
And I'm reading MOWN.
Right.
And I'm thinking to myself, TOWN, town.
Right.
Okay? So I read that, MOWN, and it's Mown.
Right. You're in your head, like I was reading Ford Perfect all those years ago.
Yeah,
You're reading Constant Mound.
Right. I read it over and over again because he's mentioned over and over and over again. And then I listen to the book.
Yes.
And he says moan.
Constant moan.
Constant moan. And it doesn't even dawn on me that word could be read as moan. Oh my gosh. Drove me crazy listening to it because I keep wanting to say, no, it's supposed to be.
Well, when you're writing this, it needs to be written unambiguously. There shouldn't. Another thing that bothers me too, and we're going to talk. I talked about names.
Yeah,
I talked about names before that he's too on the nose. Mm-hmm. Now, constant moan, MOAN.
Yep,
would be like
right there.
Too right. So he uses moan, but that's really a real word.
Right, it is.
So if you want to use the joke, you have to find a way to write it with the phonetic spelling that isn't confusing.
Right.
So it needs to be. So when he uses another real word,
right,
that's incorrect of the Douglas Adams style of writing names.
Right. Oh, man, it blows my mind. It still blows my mind.
So what I will say is I listened to it first and laughed and thought it was a little bit too on the nose.
Yes.
And they could have changed it somehow. I don't know how. But if constant was a different word.
Right.
It's too exact.
Right.
I knew that it wasn't MOAN. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't going to be.
Yeah, I wanted an H in there. If I was going to do that, I would have put an H in. I would have created my own word, and made it moan, in a different way.
So when I went to review the book and write all my notes, and I was reading and listening at the same time, when I got to Constant Moan and it was MOWN, I'm like, no, that's not right. That's a thing. He's always mowing the grass.
Right.
The grass is constantly mown. It's a real term.
I know.
So he missed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, put in MOHWN or
Yep.
something is all he
That's
needed.
what I really wanted,
Yeah. So Constant Moan had news for Jeltz. The Earth was destroyed, yes, but the orders were that all Earthlings were to also be destroyed. And there are rumors of a new colony in the Solianus Nebula where the mythical Magrathea is supposed to be. They were discovered because they put out a classified ad. And I'm thinking, okay, well, how did Earth people get to the Magrathea star cluster, and when did that happen? So I had a lot of questions waiting. Like, okay, it'll be answered.
Yep.
It'll be answered.
Sure it will. I'm still waiting, Jeff.
All right. But after successfully destroying the Earth, Vogon Jeltz is wondering what his epithet would be upon his return. The Destroyer, the Unswerving, or as his dad called him, Prostetnik's dad, Utter Bastard. Then there was a poem.
Oh, God.
Remember?
Yes.
It's your turn.
Oh, the poem? I didn't write it down.
How did you not write it down? We had this discussion.
Oh. All right, you'll have to give it to me so I can read it.
No, well, you can read it off my screen, because obviously I knew you weren't going to write it down. So, ladies and gentlemen, Brian Campbell reciting the poem.
Play thee no more by the crabby hole. Lay down thy mallet and flap flippy floppy arms. At a world of sun and tight skin, learn hate well, my little utter bastard.
So we've got one more poem for in the books.
Oh, you know what? And this is one of those asides that kind of annoyed me. There was a couple of references to Vogon poetry.
Okay, yes.
And it's not Vogon poetry. I mean, at one point, Prostetnik is admonishing his son.
Okay.
And as a punishment or something, he
Right.
says to him, give me a rhyme for...
Yes.
Whatever.
Throw out a word and say,
Yeah.
make a rhyme.
Make a rhyme for this. And I'm like, but that's not the nature of Vogon poetry to rhyme. It doesn't rhyme.
No.
It's free verse and gibberish.
Right.
It's meant to torture and be painful. So words that make sense and go together and rhyme, that's not Vogon poetry.
No. No. So the whole Vogon encounter that we just did was to set up the fact that there's this Earth colony. And then we jump back to Wowbagger's longship,
Mm-hmm.
the Tengrisnir.
Ken Grisnir. And this is weird, too, because, I mean, I know we don't get any impression, really, of Wowbagger's ship during other Wowbagger moments.
Right.
But
it is described.
is it? But it's not described like they show the picture on the book, anyway, which is like a picture of a Viking ship.
Right. It is. No, it's just a sleek little silver thing.
Yeah, that's what they describe it as.
So he's got a new ship, evidently.
Oh, okay. New ship.
New ship, yes.
Yeah, and this is part of that time zone thing that I'm going to drive me insane. A new ship which he happened to have bought from Zaphod.
Yes.
At some point in Zaphod's life that we have no idea existed.
Right. And Zaphod stole it or
Because-
got it from Thor.
Because Thor wanted to get rid of it because it annoyed the hell out of him because it loved him too much.
Right. It was a version of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation doors.
Yes.
Only amplified exponentially.
And made by a god.
And made by a god, yes.
Oh, how many more things can we shove into this ship?
I really don't know. But we're going to find out.
Oh my gosh.
On Wildbagger's ship, Arthur is awakened, and he believes he is back home on the beach where he lived for a century in the Mark II's construct.
Correct.
That disappears, and he is confronted with a computer-generated Fenchurch, who is his chamber's body optimizer. So Arthur is modest and he will not get into the shower while this computerized Fenchurch is looking. Even though he's had a whole romantic encounter and relationship with her and is madly in love with her, he's too afraid to take his clothes off and get in the shower.
Oh my gosh. He's still, there's a modicum of decorum here where, the computer says, well, I can show her without any clothes on if you like, or does
and
the
he said no.
And does his t-shirt have to be wet?
Yeah, well, that was good. That was funny. I will say that was pretty funny.
So there are some funny little bits there, but...
So after Arthur gets into the shower, the computer burned all of his clothing and creates new clothes for him that he found somewhere in Arthur's mind.
Mm-hmm.
You would have thought it would have been a bathrobe. I thought that would have been the choice.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's his prep school uniform, only in adult size. So he's got, I'm sure, these shorts and suspenders and a little green jacket. There's even a cap.
Yes. I do think it's kind of hysterical.
It was Angus Young from AC/DC.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Just imagine,
Mm-hmm.
imagine that.
Yep.
And that's what
he was
Arthur
wearing.
is.
Yep.
Yes, it was kind of funny, but not Hitchhikers.
Well, yeah, you're right.
If you wanted to do a nod to Hitchhikers,
mm-hmm. You would
put him in the dressing gown.
In the dressing gown?
Yes.
That's true. But this is his first change of clothing, really, in the whole series.
Okay, and then here was a thing that isn't explained why.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't make sense, because Wildbagger is this immortal with this god-made ship,
mm-hmm.
but he couldn't make Arthur any new clothes because he's run out of clothing credits for this cycle. I really wish they would have put in somehow that he was being messed with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they could have made him 100 suits of clothes if he wanted, but they thought it was so funny that he was in the schoolboy uniform that they didn't.
Right.
They don't ever lean one way or another that he was being messed with.
No, they don't. They don't say that, but I did think it was kind of odd.
But how do you run out of credits? I don't understand that clothing credit thing.
It's a god ship.
It's a god ship.
They work in mysterious ways, Jeff.
Yes. Here's more of this recognition problem that I had with the book.
Mm-hmm.
After the shower, Arthur meets Trillian.
Right.
And Arthur says to Trillian, "Have you seen Ford?" Trillian says, "I have, actually. He trotted past me on his way to the bridge." Arthur asked, for some reason, if there was anything different about him. I don't know why that would have been on Arthur's mind. So, like, all of a sudden, this to me is I'm trying to force something, so I'm going to ask questions that don't... Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Was there anything different about him? Trillian said his hair did seem unusually shiny. Oh, and it was blue. Shiny was first? Shiny was first before blue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just find it weird.
Mm-hmm.
And why Arthur's response to that was, it's a matter of time. It was only a matter of time. Like, what does that mean? Was it to match his shoes?
I don't know.
His blue suede shoes that he got?
I don't know. But he knows that he's gone through this transformation because the ship provides some kind of transformation in their individual chambers.
So we get to chapter 5.
5, Jeff. We made it. Chapter 5. Yay! Is that halfway? Not
no.
Quite.
After 6 will be halfway.
Oh, wow.
So this chapter starts out stating that everything is possible. Just like the ratchet screwdrivers that grow like fruit.
Right.
Then it starts throwing random words together and giving examples of that in the universe, like indignant seaweed and murderous clowns. Then it says, how about this one? How about an two-headed president of the galaxy who bought a tiny tropical planet from the Magrathians at a knockdown price, then sold it to rich Earthlings so they could live on it in comfort after their planet had been destroyed? How crazy would that be? I think that passage that makes no sense to us is the beginning of the story that this book is telling. So we get to chapter 5 of 12, and here is where they introduce the story of the book. Everything else is just set up. Now for time. The timeline.
Oh gosh. Yeah, this is troublesome. I mean, not only the timeline, but if we remember the nature of the Magrathians and the fact that the galactic financial state that they're currently in, and that they put themselves to sleep because there's no money to be made.
Right. Well, also, just take into this simple fact, Zaphod didn't know where Magrathea was in the first book.
That's correct. So the time, this is exactly what we were talking about before. And I don't know that there's any way to resolve what goes on from here. Because from here, we can't put the time together. Zaphod has one head. According to what we've read in the book here so far, that was a recent development.
Right.
It happened between the last time this group saw him and this time that he saw him. He does own and has the Heart of Gold, so it's within that time frame. But what happens in that time frame is so vast and so impossible, I'm puzzled.
Yes. So, if you start out with everything is possible.
Right.
Like, he's like, okay, guy, this is prefacing, I'm going to screw with you.
Oh, okay. So you think this line here in this book at this moment is about to tell us that everything that's happened to this point is possible because I say it is.
No, it's you can take all kinds of things from all of the books, and you can pick and choose a way it would be possible. He's not going to explain it to us. He's not going to do that work because the fans do that work anyway. So Zaphod does know Slarty Bartfast, and he has the Bistromath, which can go forward and backward in time.
That's correct.
So in the Doctor Who way, you could do anything. Zaphod didn't have to rescue anybody from Earth until long in the future, where he went back in time and then did the... So if you have time travel, anything's possible.
I guess. And we have to assume by the sequence that we go through next that that's what Zaphod's been doing, traveling in time and messing with things. But I still don't like the fact that he's able to buy this planet from the Magrathians, because there in theory should be no amount of money that could afford to buy this planet.
Correct.
And on top of that he gets a group of Earthlings to come up with enough money to buy a planet. There's just no way that works with the logistics of what we understand the Magrathian economic necessity is. The cost of that planet should be outrageously expensive.
Even if he was to deposit a penny in his timeline and take the Bistromath and go way, way into the future, get that money, Magrathea is up and running again, buy the planet. When you went back in time before the Earth was destroyed, they certainly couldn't buy it. The whole Earth couldn't buy it, much less one little group.
One little group of people, of some 200 or 300 people or something. It's really not a very small group of people that we're talking about here. And for not only for him to have sold it to them, but made a profit in the selling. I mean, that logic doesn't work.
No.
But I do kind of think, doesn't it say in there that this particular planet was kind of like a leftover or an extra that the Megartheans kind of made?
It's not very big.
Yeah.
It's a small asteroid-sized planet.
Yeah.
Correct.
So it's a strange part of the story.
Yes. Here's another passage that confused me. Arthur is laying on his bunk, looking up at the sky to where Fenchurch hovered on a cloud, wearing the same dark jeans, high boots, and sodden t-shirt that she wore when he had first seen her, passed out in the back of her brother's car. She wasn't wet.
As far as we know.
There's nothing in there that says she was on her way back from or
and
to.
It had been raining.
It was only raining when the rain god was going by.
Right. But even at that, she was inside a car.
She was in the car.
Shouldn't have been wet.
Arthur was soaked.
Yes, he was wet.
So he didn't see her in a wet T-shirt.
But I think that was one of those things where maybe he imagined a wet T-shirt.
Yes. Well, yes, absolutely. But it does, in fact, answer a question.
Mm-hmm.
In So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, when Arthur gets into the car, it says this. Behind him in the back seat was a girl who had made him crack his head on the door as he climbed in.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know if it was just because it was the first female of his own species that he had laid eyes on in years, or what it was, but he felt stupefied with... Now we know it was her wet T-shirt. So it did answer a question that he left hanging out there.
Mm-hmm.
So Arthur wants the computer in his room to show him the Grebulons to see if confronting those who destroyed the Earth would make him feel a little worse. So now the Fenchurch disappears and he's now like he's out in space.
Right.
And he zoomed to the Grebulons.
Right.
He went past Saturn, Jupiter, the asteroid belt, Mars.
Wait a minute.
Then further out past Pluto. I'm like, what solar system are you in?
One that's twisted around a little.
Yeah, so I just, again, that's something that took me out of the book.
Yeah,
and I'm
yep.
Did he write these in the wrong order?
I'm sure he did.
Did he accidentally, highlight and grab a piece that moved it? So I thought that was ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Arthur is informed that there are other Earthlings the Vogons are on their way to destroy, and Arthur wants to find a way to warn them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
what are they going to do?
I know, and it's funny. We started off this conversation, at least early in the conversation, I mentioned that it was a plot light book. And here we are, chapter 5, and we're still in the construct, essentially. Mm-hmm. Arthur's living with imagined computer vision. He's going through all of this. Basically, he's moved from Stavros Milibita Disco into Wowbagger's ship.
Right.
That's all that's happened,
yes.
plot-wise.
Yes,
absolutely. And we're halfway, almost halfway through the book.
Yes.
So it on that level, it kind of is a little disturbing to me. And that also shows that what we haven't really laid heavily on, because we're trying to push the plot forward, as in our discussion, is all the little asides that he's had about this organization and that set of people and these types of crabs and this type of thing.
Right.
There's been hundreds of them to point.
Yes, and I didn't write down. I'm looking it up right now to see what. So I want to give everybody an example of a guide note, because right here in my notes I say there's a guide note that refers to the Golgafrinchans that has no grounding in anything we have ever learned.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts out like something that Douglas Adams would write. Throughout recorded history, the ability to state one's case well has generally had about as much success as talking things out reasonably or putting aside our differences. The people who use these tactics generally mean well and would make excellent motivational speakers or kindergarten teachers, but on no account should they be put in charge of situations where lives are at stake. Malapropos comments, such as, "I know we have always seen eye to eye," tend to send negotiations spiraling toward disaster, especially if the other species representative suffers from globular organ envy or thinks you are being a patronizing git. Successful negotiations are invariably conducted from a position of power, or at least the perception of power. Strolling into a new meeting wearing a comfortable robe and smelling of incense with a sincere desire to iron out difficulties is perversely a surefire way to get everyone killed. General Anasarcista, the acknowledged prince of negotiators, once claimed that while on the job, he never used a sentence that did not include at least one zark, 2 shits, and half a dozen ass cracks. His final pronouncement contained only a single shit and was uttered in the form of an authoritative command to his bowels, which had locked up as a result of too many hours seated around the negotiation table. Unfortunately, because of their thin bowel walls, Golgafrinchians are prone to catastrophic bowel ruptures, so General Anasarcistus' final utterance was also what killed him. Okay, that gives you an idea of the length of the guide note.
That's correct.
The tangential nature of the guide note. And the what the hell nature of the guide note.
Yeah, that's an excellent example of how you're taken away from the story, and pieces of it might be funny, but it's just filler.
Right. So I hope there are people who have continued to listen after that, because I don't believe I'm going to be reading any more guide notes.
I think when they heard your sigh there, they probably paused as well as I did.
Yes. So Trillian has also taken this opportunity to interview Wowbagger. And we learn that he has given up on the alphabetical thing, and he does it by planets now.
Right.
He simply pulls into orbit, drops a data bomb into the atmosphere, and everyone gets an email with a sound file.
Yeah, see, that again, obviously, time has gone on, and new technologies have been introduced.
Right. So that's similar to a severe weather alert or an amber alert where everybody's phones are getting messages all at the same time. Well, that brings us to Chapter 6.
Chapter 6!
So Chapter 6 starts out with, far out in the fringes of the dark nebula of Solianus and Ram, there is a planet.
Solianus and Ram.
Solianus and Ram. There is a planet that they called Nano.
And did you catch this? The catalog number for that planet was 1001001.
We've heard that before.
Have we heard it 42 times?
42 times, yes. So the digital binary representation of 42 was the catalog number of the planet Nano. There's a single continent on that planet called Innisfree.
And an abundance of fjords.
Yes. 2 towns. The larger one is Kong. These names were taken from the movie Quiet Man by the registration officer Hillman Hunter.
Have you seen The Quiet Man?
I don't believe so.
I haven't either, and there's a lot of reference to it in this particular part of the book.
Yes.
Makes me want to know what the heck it was all about.
So Hillman Hunter also decided that this planet needs a god to rule over it and keep the people in order.
You know what's funny about, and I know we're getting into this here, but this just drives me insane. Because we're going to find out all about Hillman Hunter and his the way that he brought these folks to this planet.
Right.
And one of the key features of Hillman is that he created a religion.
Yes.
So he created a religion without a god?
Yes. Evidently.
And that's I'm like, no. You might have created a set of conditions or created a way to live or something, but you didn't create a religion.
Right. True.
Anyway.
Well, that's going to bring me to this point.
Mm-hmm.
Is right here, the beginning of chapter 6 of 12,
Mm-hmm.
is, to me, what the book is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know for a fact, but the feeling that I get when reading this is Eoin Colfer had a story idea in his head.
Mm-hmm.
He had a story of an Earth colony that left Earth, went to another planet, and needed to advertise to find a god. And they did all of these interviews to find this god, and there were conflicting religions and whatever. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you wanted to say the nuts and bolts of what the story is, colony of Earthlings leave Earth, settle on another planet, decide they want a religion, need to find a god, they run an ad. That is the story idea that he had when he
That's
decided...
his elevator pitch.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had that, and somebody asked him, or he decided he wanted to write the 6th Hitchhiker novel.
Mm-hmm.
So he used 5 chapters to manipulate our characters to this point.
I can see how that could feel that way, because again, like plot.
Yes.
We're now 5 chapters in, and we've moved about who knows how far in space, but certainly in time, very little.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely.
So I can thoroughly understand where that's going. But don't you find it funny that the god he's interviewing is Cthulhu?
Cthulhu? Yes. Yeah, he's interviewing Cthulhu. The great old one. And Cthulhu was a demigod, and he explained in the advertisement that he wanted a grade A god, and the demigod was just not going to cut it, so he wrote no callback on his interview folder.
Right after when he asked him what his goal is for the next 5 years, and he said to pillage the planet and stack up all the skulls.
Right.
And he's like, pillage and stack? Is that really what you want to do? No callback.
Yeah.
But I mean, and the other thing I thought was a little odd for at least a book of the current phase, or when was this book written? Do we know that date?
2009.
2009. Okay. It's interesting to me that this book, having been written in 2009, a lot has changed. I know we're living in a different world now.
Yeah.
But the misogynistic nature of Hillman Hunter, I mean, it's just all the way out there. And
yes, it is.
It's completely exposed in this story, and no holes are barred. I mean, he laughs about the idea of there being a goddess rather than a god.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
and that's just the most mild of
Correct.
his misogynistic things that he says in this story, which to me is a little surprising.
Like in the other novels that Douglas Adams wrote for Hitchhikers, this one jumps back and forth almost as much as Life, the Universe, and Everything.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to jump back now to the Heart of Gold.
Okay.
And Zaphod arrives outside of Asgard,
Oh.
which is icy and cold, but he cannot get in because of the new defenses that have been installed specifically to keep him out.
Right.
So there's a long and storied history that we are only finding out about that we have no idea when it could have possibly happened.
Right. And it's funny. I think you and I, we try not to have too many conversations about what's going on in the book or the story before we actually do the broadcast, because obviously we want it to be fresh and up to date. But I did mention this.
Yes.
I said to Jeff, while I was reading the book and even after I was listening to it, Zaphod on the bridge just about killed me. I literally don't think I wrote a single note. And when I'm talking about the bridge, it's the Rainbow Bridge between the entrance to Asgard, and it's guarded by Helmhold, and it's a story.
Yes. So what I wrote in my notes is to keep up the tradition of long, tedious conversations. There was one between Zaphod and Heimdall.
Heimdall, yes.
the gatekeeper of Asgard.
Mm-hmm.
Zaphod was told he had to perform 3 tasks before he was allowed to cross the bridge. He negotiated it down to 1. He could cross the bridge, but dragons would be sent for him. The only good thing that came of the conversation was when Zaphod blew into his hands and said, "Good. Great. Can we get on with it then? I am freezing. My spare neck hole really feels the cold." Which, incidentally, is the title of my next album.
Oh my god.
So, they're mentioned spare neck hole.
Yes.
So, there in black and white print
Mm-hmm.
is proof that he had side-by-side heads
Correct.
in this iteration.
Correct. And it's during this story where they're going back and forth between Zaphod's relationship with Thor
Mm-hmm.
that we have so many problems with the timeline. Because we have no idea how Zaphod... Well, the Thor story could have happened possibly before all of this stuff.
Right.
So that one I'm willing to forgive a little bit.
Yes.
That did not happen in the timeline of any of the stories, any of the Hitchhiker guide stories. I'm even assuming it happened before that. you
Right.
know. But some of the other stuff that happens here just doesn't make any logical sense.
Right.
And the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and it sort of relates more to what you were saying, he had a story he wanted to write, and now he had to fill in all the gaps. At Milliways, Thor and his retinue
Right.
are described as minor gods.
Yes. Yes, they are.
And
Minor
we
deities.
had minor deities. And we had a discussion, you and I did, about why would they be minor. And I said well, they're gods from the earth, and the earth is a minor place, etc., etc. Well, here he says, oh no, thousands of planets worship Thor and their gods.
Right.
And the gods of Asgard. And I'm like, okay.
Well, yeah, but it was still minor deities.
Yeah.
That is written.
Well, yeah, but
That's-
even when you consider, the infinity of the universe, thousands would be microscopically small.
Right. There would be no major.
Yeah,
Okay. So, but he advertised for Class A.
right.
And
And I
Thor's going to fit that bill, but now it's minor.
Yeah, I know. That's why I kept going back and forth. He's
If I was going to use an Asgardian god as the Class A, Odin would be the one,
right.
not Thor.
Right.
Just like Zeus
Right.
is, or Jupiter is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You can't use the underlings. They're not the Class
They're
A.
bees.
Yeah, they're bees.
They're bees. The bees.
So then we jump to the Vogon ship, the business end, and we learn that Constant Moan has sensitivity, empathy, and a modicum of grace. He also had Earth contraband.
Yes, a small Barbie mirror.
Yes.
I love it.
How timely is that?
Oh.
I laughed at that. For whatever
Yes.
reason, that was the funniest part of the
Yes.
whole book to me,
Yes.
is having a Barbie mirror.
Yes, that was great.
So not only was he not repulsed by his reflection,
Mm-hmm.
he realized that he didn't hate himself.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not the old Vogon. He's starting to evolve.
Mm-hmm. Which
Like
is
the-
scary.
It's the biggest sin, though,
Yes,
to the
for
Vogons.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah. And he also realized that he wanted to, and was the only one who could, save the Earth colony.
Right.
So the Vogons are out to this planet Nano to get rid of that Earth colony to complete their mission. And Vogon Jeltz's son is trying to save them.
All because he accidentally ate the wrong food.
Pretty much. Yeah. Yeah. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 6.
Oh my gosh, really, Jeff?
Which is going to bring us to the end of Part 1 of
Oh,
this book's
no.
podcast.
Yes.
And we will do Part 2 as our bonus episode this month in a couple of weeks.
Excellent, excellent.
So until we get there, Brian, I think it's time to say goodbye. So
I'll wave to you from the Rainbow Bridge as I say goodnight.
how many tasks did Heimdall give you?
1. Go to bed.
Yes. Thank you for listening to Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea. Look for us the first Thursday of every month for a full episode. We will also release a bonus episode later in the month. A very special thanks goes out to Luke, Max, Greg, and Tim Lesnick for arranging and performing our opening theme. We would also like to thank our talented friends and family for their voice work on our introductions and commercials. Visit our website at digitalwatchesareaprettyneatidea.buzzsprout.com, where you can find links to all my Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy inspired t-shirt designs. You can find us on Facebook and YouTube as Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea, on Instagram at Watches Idea Podcast, and on Twitter, or should I say X, at Watches Idea. If you'd like to contact us, our email is digitalwatchespodcast@gmail.com.
This has been a Froods for Thought production.